Okay, so schools of economics. So we could start with classical economics. Classical economics, we could think of Adam Smith as kind of your classical economist, the founder of the discipline. Classical economics does not really use math. It's very close to political economy. It's concerned with, as Smith puts it, the wealth of nations. It's concerned to some degree with distribution. It's concerned to some degree with what makes a good political system. And what tends to really define classical economics when you're looking from a great distance is what's called the labor theory of value. So where does value come from in classical economics? It comes from the labor that a person puts into it. So maybe this in some ways comes from Locke's notion of property, that you kind of mingle, your labor with the natural world. We can say labor theory of value. So classical economics concerned with Smith is arguing against mercantilism for more free trade, often goes by the name of political economy to show it's more capacious. It's thinking of politics and economics. You can still read these books today. The sentences are long, the words are different, but you can still follow along. So the real big transition from classical economics and political economy to economics, as it's understood today, comes with the marginal revolution. And the marginal revolution is a scientific revolution that happens in a couple different places simultaneously, right? This is one of these things that you see in the history of science. Like, there'll be some breakthrough, like Darwin has a breakthrough, but like somebody else has sort of the same breakthrough at the same time, you totally, differently. So there's a version of marginalism that's continental. There's a version in the German-speaking lands, in the French-speaking lands, and in Britain, and they all kind of come together. And the shift is in the theory of value. So the theory of value in marginalism is on the margin. So say you have one apple and you want a second one, how much is going from one apple to two apple worth for you? Probably quite a bit. If you had 10 apples, maybe going to 11 apples doesn't matter that much. The marginal value is less. So what marginalism does, though, most importantly, is it opens the door to math and economics, because it means you can graph this now. You can depict this relationship graphically. And there's some really interesting work in the history of economics that shows a lot of the people who developed marginalism were looking to physics as a model. Physics, the queen of the sciences. And so they were thinking, they imported terms from the natural world to describe the social world through the lens of economics. Terms like equilibrium. So the idea being that if you looked at a market would reach equilibrium when everybody is bought and sold all that they want, or the price will settle at an equilibrium price when it's really the demand and supply are matching up.
And some of these ideas are things we would pick up at a microeconomics class?
Oh, yes. This is still out there. This is sort of the basic foundation of microeconomics, marginal analysis. And so in the German-speaking intellectual tradition, this is the root of Austrian economics. And people picking up the marginal revolution in the German-speaking lands are opposed to the historicists, who are thinking in a more evolutionary way about how societies kind of grow and change. And they have a vision of economic ideas as applying differently to different types of social arrangements. Where the marginalists, remember, are inspired by physics, and this is a set of natural laws that applies anywhere to any sort of human society. So that's his first really big fissure that we'll see again and again. Are you historically minded? Do certain traits of economic life adhere, and become expressed in certain types of societies? Or are there universal economic laws that flow through any type of society? So that's kind of a juncture, a break. And so marginalism, first, people start using really geometry to kind of graph things, but marginalism is also opening up to the possibility of calculus and the possibility of creating models. But at that point in time, late 19th century, a model is something like a physicist does, Like, think of like an inclined plane and how fast does the ball roll from one to the other. It's a physical representation of the world. And eventually economists will start to create mathematical representations of the world. But we're not quite there yet. So we're late 19th century, and we have this fissure, we have this introduction of marginal analysis that marks the juncture from classical economics to economics. So let's say now we have economics, but we still have this fissure between historical thinking and, let's call it, natural law thinking. That's not quite right, but physical laws versus contingency. And then in the United States, this ends up mapping onto debates about capitalism. And so more historically minded economists tend to be interested in the progressive movement, and which is invested in taming and regulating industrial capitalism and changing its excesses, factory safety laws, wage laws, working conditions laws. Yet in general, American economists all use marginal analysis, just in different ways. The ones who are more drawn to marginal analysis become known as neoclassical economists. They're neoclassical. The neo is because they're using marginal analysis. The classical is because they don't think we need to change the way the economy operates or the government operates. They're not progressive. Whereas the progressives are saying things like we need to use social control. The state and the people collectively and democratically need to control the way economics unfolds and make sure things are fair and equal. So that school of thought becomes known as institutional economics in the United States by the 20th century. So it's part of the progressive movement, late 19th century. Into the 20th century, it really becomes institutional economics. And it's quite dominant. And the neoclassical economists are still there, but they're very much a minority. And Frank Knight, Milton Friedman's teacher, is one of the minority neoclassical economists. And the institutionalists are much more progressive still.
Is it fair to say that the neoclassical folks and even the classical folks versus the institutional economics folks, they have a disagreement about how much government intervention that should be in the economy? So neoclassical is less intervention, and then institutional economists, the progressive folks, has more intervention.
Yes, exactly right. So this is the situation in the 1920s, but the other piece I should mention is the first generation of progressive economists were very radical. They were closely allied with the socialist movement, with labor radicalism, and many of them lost their jobs at universities. This is kind of connects to the dawn of academic freedom. This is before academic freedom. And they were chastened. They became much more mainstream. By the time we get to the 1920s, we don't really have radical critiques of society coming from economists. Much smaller profession, much less important than it is today, and fairly peaceful, because the 1920s are a fairly peaceful decade in the United States. So this is a situation when the Great Depression hits. And as I mentioned before, the kind of most important institutional economist is Wesley Mitchell. And he has said, he's written a whole book on business cycles. But he doesn't see this business cycle coming, and it hits, and he doesn't have a good explanation for it. Now, perhaps the preeminent neoclassical economist was Irving Fisher. Now, Irving Fisher is big into the stock market, and Irving Fisher says sometime in late summer 1929, stocks are going ever higher and will continue to go ever higher forever. And so he loses his reputation after the stock market crash. So Milton Friedman is stepping into a field in which the greats have been discredited, and there's an enormous economic crisis all around.
And everybody's struggling to figure out why the crisis happened.
Yes. Right? And the other thing he's stepping into is a world where in the United States, there's a great deal of anger at capitalism, at the system, unemployed people on the street. In Europe, there's rising fascist movements. In Asia, there's rising fascist movements. And so everyone's very concerned about this. And Friedman is seeing a lot of this through the lens of Frank Knight, who feels like we are maybe reaching the end of what he calls liberalism. He calls himself an old-fashioned liberalism. We're reaching the end of representative democratic government because representative democratic government cannot solve these social problems. And capitalism as it has developed, Knight is very pro-capitalist, but he says it's generating inequality and this is putting too many strains on the system. So Knight will become one of the people who helps Friedman think, how do I develop a new theory of capitalism that works in an era of mass democracy, where people can vote and people can express at the ballot box their unhappiness with what's happening economically. So this larger movement will generate, of which F.A. Hayek is a part, Friedman is a part, and it becomes the very early stirrings of trying to think about a new sort of liberalism, which will eventually be called neoliberalism.